Welcome to the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance podcast. I'm your new host, Heidi Wilding. Today, we will talk with Rachael Lauritzen, the MESA Board Chair. We'll talk about recycling, waste reduction, and how we as individuals can get involved with our local government. Stay with us. So, Rachael, could you introduce yourself to us?
Sure. I live in South Salt Lake, Utah, but I grew up in Bountiful. I was the oldest of 7 kids, and we did a lot of fun things. We really enjoy doing Utah, the camping and the mountains. So I currently live in South Salt Lake. I have a daughter who's in high school, and I have a dog and a cat who keep us company. I went to BYU, got an English degree. Didn't get something to go with the English degree, so I've been sort of puttering along in an eccentric sort of career path. And I have a lot of interests. Before the pandemic, I was running a chocolate society, and I really like to read, I like to go hiking, I like to knit, and do a lot of music. I had a music minor, and I like to garden a lot, actually. And part of that started to segue into things like natural dyeing. So I've been growing some dye plants, and as well as herbs and the usual things in the garden. So that's been a lot of fun.
Dang, that's awesome. Let's get into the questions. The first question that I wanted to ask you is, I know that you were Recycler of the Year in 2007? Is that what it was?
2005.
2005. I'd love it if you could tell me about that experience and how that was kind of a political awakening for you and what that inspired you to learn and grow and do.
Okay. Well, what really happened was I moved into a new house. I crossed the border from what was then unincorporated county, where we had curbside recycling, to South Salt Lake, where we didn't. And I wanted curbside recycling because it was convenient. And so I called the city, ended up talking to the mayor, and he wasn't very interested in the idea. And so for a year, my husband and I, we just saved up our recycling and we took it other places. A lot of it was people in the other neighborhoods. We'd just go looking for empty cans or semi-empty cans and just use their recycling bins, but that wasn't sustainable. So I called the city again, and I ended up talking to the mayor again, and I pushed harder, and he invited me to talk to the city council. I think he was hoping I would kind of give up, but I didn't. I ended up talking to my neighbor who was on the city council, and he invited me to doing a citizen summit that they had just been planning. So they had gathered up a bunch of residents to come talk about how the city is run and budget and decisions, and talking about what we wanted to see, because everybody talks about all the amenities. And then we started looking at those priorities, and then starting looking at the costs, like how much you pay for a police officer and how much it costs to do any number of things, right? And so it was a really good sort of 101 on city governance. And so that was helpful. And in the meantime, I started meeting some of the other city council members and talking about my project a little bit, and one of them suggested getting a petition, which I'd never done before. So I thought I'll do a petition. And I reached out to some of the community council leads, and we ended up getting a petition of 220 people, which was a record at that time. The next one after that had been 30, so they were very impressed, even though it's, like I say, it's a small town in a big metropolis, I guess, but it was a good showing for what we had. And in the meantime, I also did some research with the waste management companies and saw who was willing and what their rates were. And the mayor at the meeting, he wasn't going to stop it, but he felt like it should pay for itself. And so what ended up happening was the city council, they had to do their due diligence, and so they sort of redid the work I had done. And the waste management company was willing, but they wanted a certain threshold of people to sign up. And we were actually short by the deadline, but they decided for whatever reason, that because we'd shown so much pluck, I think is what it boiled down to, so they were going to do it anyway. And so, because it was a voluntary program. And eventually, after a few years, the city council expanded that into mandatory recycling citywide. And since then, they have added, just recently, glass recycling in its own bin. So, which was exciting because that's more recyclable than a lot of the other stuff. So near the end of that process is when I heard from the Recycling Coalition, because I'd been reaching out to a number of groups to say, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. How should I do it? Can you help me? And they also felt like it was a good effort. And so they gave me the award for doing all that legwork, really, and getting recycling to my little town.
Wow. And even glass recycling, too.
That's a really positive development, I think. So
absolutely. And I think one takeaway from that story that's important is that nothing just happens immediately. It always takes time.
Yes, especially with city governance. That's one of the things that I've learned is, you read about things happening in the paper and residents finding out that something's about to go in, thinking it's been slipped under their noses. And most of the time that's not the case. They've been laying the groundwork for years in many cases. And in this case, actually, it was a fairly short turnaround time. It was about 6 months. But even then, I ended up going to a city council meeting ahead of time because I'd never been to one. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And so I just went to see what was the format. How did they do a city council meeting? And it was a good education for me. And I eventually, so because of that experience, a few years later, there was a mayoral election, and our current mayor was running for the first time. And she had come to my house because somebody had pointed her my way, saying I was community-minded. And so I started questioning her about like LED stoplights and other environmental city initiatives. And by the end of the conversation, she'd offered me a job on the Planning Commission, which is an advisory board to the city council. And so we do usually boring stuff, code updates and some of the, it depends on the city code, but there are a lot of lesser things that you can basically take some workload off without being controversial. So we still follow a lot of the same processes, and then some of the things we do, it's sort of the first stop before it goes to the city council for the last stop, and they decide for sure on some of those things. But it was really fascinating to see that whole process and to realize how much work, how much time goes into it. And politics are always in it, but really at the city level, my experience anyway, is that people are really just trying to do the best that they can for the residents. So
absolutely. So based off of that, what you just said, those people that are seeing a problem in their neighborhood, seeing a problem, or they feel like something has been slipped under the rug and they haven't noticed, what suggestions would you have to those people to get involved, and how would you recommend that they get started being active in the political world and where they live?
Well, start going to meetings. They are required by law to have public notices, and if it's something that's within a certain number of feet of your home, they will send you a notice. And it's really just a question of being aware. So usually they'll put things in the newspapers or the community paper, and they'll put it on their website. They usually have several venues where they put the notices of meetings, what the agendas are. And so just keeping track of what's going on. And nowadays it's even easier because they've been doing live recordings for a number of years now. It was way before the pandemic, although I'm sure everybody does it now. But just be involved and see what is going on. And if you think something should be different, call and ask the city and say, well, what's going on with this issue? What's the work that you've already done about it? And usually they'll be so excited that a resident has called and wants to help and be involved. Like that first the city council meeting that I went to, all of the city councilors were all at Twitter because they had a real resident there. And it wasn't a controversial thing. I was just sitting there listening. I was the only one, actually, that night. But so they were all just all excited. And then they all came down afterward to shake my hand and introduce themselves. And because people are so detached, it was a rarity.
Absolutely. That's really cool. It's amazing that you could be there in the first place, and that we all can be in those kinds of meetings, in those kinds of discussions, and also that we're seen and heard in those kinds of discussions.
Yeah. And I mean, it's important to go being, a good, I guess, polite. Sometimes people go in all raging to tear down the whatever. But if you go in it with a sort of let's work together attitude, especially if there's an issue you're concerned about, people are usually willing to work with you. So if you're going in there trying to tell them how they've got it all backwards when you haven't listened to what they've had to say, it doesn't really go very far.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, sweet. Thank you for that advice. Going back to the topic of recycling, it's obviously something that you're passionate about, so much so that you have in the past and currently gone the extra mile to make it happen. What role do you think that recycling and waste reduction plays in our environmental stewardship?
That is a big piece of it. And actually, the irony is that recycling is really not the panacea that we sort of think of it as being. We all feel virtuous when we put our stuff in the recycling, but a number of things that we put in there actually shouldn't be put in there. And
right,
because of the changing laws with China not accepting our waste and other things going on, only about 10% of the things that are sent for recycling are actually recycled. It might be closer to like 8 or 9%, but it's around 10%. And sometimes people put in things that are clearly inappropriate. They call it wish cycling. And so really, the goal would be to reduce the amount of waste that you are producing at all, because a lot of it can't be recycled, especially with the plastics. Even the stuff that's got the right plastic number, your 1s and your 2s, and they can only be recycled a certain number of times, and then they get degraded and they still have to go to the landfill. And the problem is that plastic doesn't biodegrade. As we know, it photodegrades. And so whether it goes through the landfills or some other method, usually it ends up in the soil. And then from the soil, it ends up in the water. And then it gets into our water systems. It gets into our food, whether it's plant or animal. And then we end up ingesting it and we have health problems. Not to mention all of the ecological problems with having a lot of plastic in our water. It amplifies some of the heat trapping properties of the water, so which causes other things.
So putting that into simpler words, I guess, plastic doesn't ever break down. It just breaks up into little pieces. And they don't disappear.
Yes, from a human perspective, yes. I mean, eventually, in a very long time, it will break down. But that's a long time.
Right.
So on a human scale, it really doesn't go away. And so really what you want to do is avoid it altogether. And that's not just with the obvious plastic. It's also with our clothing. There's a lot of plastic in our clothing. And whenever we wash it, and especially, I was surprised to learn this, when we dry it, a lot of microfibers get put out into the environment and they go through the water system, and it's the same thing. And they've done studies, like in the San Francisco Bay, where they can measure the quantities of microfiber pollution. And most of it is synthetic. So acrylics and polyesters and things like that, which are all plastic derivatives, essentially. So really what you want to do is use what's already made, avoid single-use plastics, because there are times when plastic is entirely appropriate, like medical devices and things like that. It's not all or nothing, but it is important that we drastically reduce our plastic consumption, especially if it's single-use, one time, for convenience, but then it lasts for 500 years or more. So
right. Absolutely. That's crazy to think about. It's such a normal thing to have your bag of cereal or have your soda can or your plastic bottle, your water bottle, whatever it may be. It's just such a normal thing. Or your granola bar. You unwrap it, you eat it, you throw it in the trash. It's so simple. It's so just, we don't even think about it at all. And so it's there, it's a normal part of our lives, we throw it away, it disappears. But it never really does in our lifetime.
Yeah, and so that's where you get things like the rise of the zero waste movement, where the goal is to reduce your waste as much as possible. Zero is sort of the ultimate goal that most people don't. But I think the other part of it, too, is just trying to vote with your dollar and also with your choices. Like anything that you use, and I don't want to harp too much on plastic, but any of those plastic things you use, there's usually a reusable and or recyclable option available. I've bought stainless steel water bottles from the thrift store, and then you can make a carrier. And actually, most of our water supplies are at least as good, if not better, than what's being sold in the bottled water. If you look into that whole story, the bottled water that we're getting sold is being pristine and everything. It's tap water. You're paying for the packaging, and the packaging doesn't go away. So, but you can make reusable bags that you can wash, which is a big bonus, and then over time they pay for themselves. Or if it's an old t-shirt, which there are t-shirt bag patterns all over, you can just put that to another use and then you reduce your waste. But it really is a question of recalibrating our consumption versus our creativity, and first refusing unnecessary things and then reducing the amount that we use and making those uses thoughtful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it caught my attention when you said speaking with our dollars and speaking with our actions. Can you expound a little bit more on that?
Well, some of it has to do with the purchases that we choose. Really, though, the bigger impact, and this is where I started getting involved with MESA, is when I started realizing that I could be a paragon of reusable everything, natural everything, whatever. I could stop driving a car, and we would still have a lot of these same problems with air pollution, water pollution, our warming climate, all of those things, because of the scale. So one person by themselves isn't going to make that huge difference. Although one person making those choices does affect a lot of other people. So I don't want to diminish the ripple effect that that has. But really, to get the change that we need at the scale that we need policy change. And so that's the other part of not just voting at the ballot and not just voting at the cash register, but also speaking up, talking about it, whether it's with your neighbors and your family, and not in a preachy sort of way, but also just this is a problem. Every summer now we're having dirty air because of the wildfires, because of these droughts that are being caused by climate change, right? And we're having issues with water pollution and other things from the pollutants that we put into our waterways, not just the plastic. And that costs money, but it also affects our health, right? And so really what it means is to get comfortable with that local government piece of it, whether you're talking about your city or your county or your state, because that's where you can make the most impact. And once you can start building on your policy and encouraging the environmentally friendly regulations and discouraging the ones that are not, that's when you start to really get the scale that you need to make a difference. Because a lot of the companies are just going to keep doing what they've been doing because it's cheap,
right?
Until they have to stop. And it's not that we don't want them to make money, but there are other ways of making money that don't damage the planet and our health. So it sort of answers your question, but it sort of takes it another direction. But that's what I've learned.
Yeah. So just wrapping up a little bit, what if there were one project, if I could take away all time limitations, all responsibilities, if there were one project that you would want to devote your time to and make a change for, what do you think that would be?
I would say regenerative agriculture, and in an equitable way. So the climate equity is an issue, right? Because the climate change affects those who are disadvantaged already in a number of ways because they have less resilience. But the regenerative agriculture actually has a big impact because it's not only our food, it's also our clothing. And what they found is that when you farm in a way that is not merely organic or something. It's a more holistic thing. So you have animals and crops and trees, the silvopasture, all together. And you can have your food sources and your textile fiber sources, all of those things together. And when they're together, it's actually more beneficial for everybody. So when there are trees where the livestock are, the animals have better living conditions. They can graze, they can roam. You have a more thriving ecosystem because they leave their poop and then the plants come in and all of these things. There's a lot of feedback, and you have diversity so that when there is an issue with crop failure or some sort of pest or, there's more resilience in the system. And you also end up sequestering a lot more of the carbon. So that's where I would like to spend my time. Part of it is because I love the textile arts, and that's where a lot of my creative outlets are with natural dyeing and natural knitting, things like that. There's a lot of stuff I could go into. I also like gardening, but having that and then reducing our dependence on the fossil fuels and going to cleaner energy. But if it were me, I would be going towards that regenerative agriculture and then probably doing everything, because I like to do all the things I can't, but if I could, I would. So
yeah, well, I love that. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for sharing your experiences and your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, talk to you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
If you are interested in this topic or other environmental issues, be sure to check out our website, www.mesastewardship.org. We are also on all social media platforms at Mormon Stewards.